Okay, so my job is to introduce our speaker today, Jerome Whitington. He received his PhD in anthropology at University of California, Berkeley in 2008. And he has held a number of postdocs, visiting, adjunct, and research fellow positions at the New School University, Dartmouth College, National University of Singapore, and New York University over the last number of years. In 2020, he was appointed to his present position as a clinical assistant professor. And that may be a question you want to ask about in the question period, what that actually means. At the Gallatin School at New York University, where he's presently working. So he has edited a number of journal special issues and has had many articles and book chapters in peer-reviewed publications come out over the years. But today he'll be presenting about his book, Anthropogenic Rivers, the Production of Uncertainty in Laos Hydropower, which was published in 2018 by Cornell University Press. He's also working on other projects since then, because that was based on his PhD research. He's about half finished another project, another book, which is called Experimental Earth, a speculative anthropology of climate change. So in recent years, he has been shifting his research from Lao hydropower to climate change and carbon issues, drawing heavily on SDS scholarship, or science and technology studies, and anthropology. So without further ado, Jerome, take it away.
Okay. Hi everybody, thanks for having me today. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thanks to Ian and to Mary for all of the wonderful support. So this is based, generally speaking, on my book, which came out a couple years ago. I haven't been working in Laos since then. And what I've written here is partly for an upcoming publication, revisiting some of this material, and then I'm adding in some more conceptual ideas to propose this proposition: late industrial environments are constituted by uncertainty. So I'm going to kind of toggle between what I've written for this upcoming publication and some sort of more general and conceptual thoughts. Imagine a 27-meter high dam spanning a narrow cleft in a low mountain ridge. The setting is central Laos, where a series of rivers descend from the Annamite Ridge, marking the border with Vietnam in the east, toward the Mekong River that forms the border with Thailand in the west. The curved arc of the dam presents a convex surface of concrete grace, interrupted as if by Gothic ribs, regularly spaced to provide added strength to this critical body of infrastructure. We sit across from the dam, myself and a research assistant, being offered a tour by a local village leader. Looking upstream, the reservoir is brimming with energy during this monsoon afternoon. The clouds in the distant mountain are moody and foreboding, the river churning with its own power as it flows over the concrete spillway into an expanse of white water below the Thun Hin Boom Dam. In the words of Donna Haraway, for this relatively modest project, the imaginary and the real figure each other in concrete fact. The dam spans some 250 meters across this mountain cleft, holding back a volume of water weighing millions of tons. The design matters. Hydraulically, the Thun Hin Boom Dam is a transbasin diversion scheme, which means that the water is taken out of this large river and channeled about 5 kilometers through a mountain ridge and dumped into a much smaller river where the power station is. The elevation difference is crucial for its power generating capacity because it provides the remarkable pressure, some 28 atmospheres of pressure, to power the turbines. The tunnel itself is lined with 28 centimeter thick precast concrete segments that are just over 7 meters in diameter. Eli Ilanov has offered that concrete offers the promise of permanence. Meanwhile, engineers describe some of the challenges to which the concrete tunnel lining was addressed, including reducing the friction from the rapidly flowing water, which would substantially reduce the energy available for power generation, and also to ensure against the possibility of what they call a water hammer event, That is, a potentially catastrophic pressure wave that can cause structural failure of the engineering works. So I want to use this hydropower facility to talk about what we can call late industrial environments. Now, probably by the end of the talk, I won't necessarily have convinced you of this proposition, but at least I would like to explain what I mean. So what do we mean by late industrial environments? This might not look very much like an industrial environment. We don't see any factories. We don't see any workers that are upset. But certainly thinking about extraction in the context of the relations of production, there's a kind of definitional issue that would make this a late industrial environment, since the electricity is being exported to Thailand for the provincial markets in the northeast of Thailand. There's also a really substantive issue that we could use to talk about a late industrial environment. And because it shares a lot of similarities with some of the toxic environments that have been discussed by people like Kim Fortune, Michelle Murphy, or Adriana Petrena. So Kim Fortune wrote a book about the Bhopal industrial accident in 1984 in central India, talking about the complexities to which a toxicological event really ricocheted through the forms of knowledge, both vernacular and expertise, through Bhopal and through India more broadly. When we talk about late industrial environments, we want to think about a number of issues, or we want to hold in view a number of issues regarding uncertainty. It's a methodological term. It's proposing that we ask questions in a certain kind of way to think about the relationship between existing forms of knowledge that may be expert or vernacular, but really thinking about the inadequacy of existing knowledge to understand contemporary socio-environmental relationships. We also want to think about actual biopolitical relationships and the ways that those themselves are uncertain. The uncertainty is built into the temporal and material relationships. So it's not only like a discursive or an epistemic term or simply a cultural term, right? And then the last thing I want to call our attention to is the ways that certain actors use uncertainty as a power strategy. For example, corporate tactics of investment and rule. So we can talk about the production of uncertainty as something that is deliberate. So on the one hand, we have a massive concrete dam, which stands as a kind of image for the mastery and control of the brute forces of nature. But if that is the case, then the dream of riparian domination also presents a paradox. For the apparent solidity of the concrete precipitates a cascade of open-ended transformations in ecologies and lives that are thrust into an unknown future. In what follows, I want to sketch hydropower's cascade of concrete uncertainties across four terms that link the affective and the cognitive, the imaginative and the real. So these four terms are promise, management, apprehension, and commitment. So I want these to add texture when we talk about the ways in which things that we don't understand push us to think differently about the world that we live in. Just as a bit of background, in the early 2000s, the Laos hydropower industry, with major support from the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, was attempting to establish the social basis through which large dams could be publicly negotiated, funded, and built. Following the 2006 decision to move forward with the highly controversial Nam Toon 2 project, this basis for legitimation was more or less established. And following that, a torrent of new projects quickly flooded the country's numerous highland valleys. In this context, public negotiation here largely refers to the international community of transnational NGOs, some of the advocacy networks that were involved, development NGOs, and other people that were concerned, sort of stakeholders that were concerned with industrial multilateral lenders coming out of the 1990s and 2000s. Sometimes that was in alliance with popular movements on the ground, such as in India, but in many cases, especially in Laos, there wasn't any significant popular mobilization, considering the role of the authoritarian government. So people and other living beings living along Laos's rivers at that time were really having to contend with, first of all, an industry that was used to getting what it wants, but it was also busy burnishing its new green credentials. They also had to learn to cope with the form of neoliberal development finance that was interested in regulating and disciplining the Laos state using environmental norms. Right? So the World Bank was saying, hey, we're going to put in place these environmental mechanisms. And then finally, those people had to contend with the paternalistic state, rightly concerned with its own autonomy and development, yet convinced that modernity entails moving people away from rivers and hills towards towns and roads. I note that modernity and development are social projects that project a future. Jan Petiers has described development as the management of a promise, and a promise is a kind of opportunistic speech act that takes advantage of the unstable possibilities at hand. So this brings me to my first term of uncertainty, promise. Large dam projects are like strange attractors or magnets that pull all kinds of people into their powerful orbit of desire. Asking what people want from dams, what is the locus of the power built into their hydrology and mythology, already foregrounds the trembling uncertainty apparent in terms like anticipation, used by Vincent Adams, or what Mike Fortune calls the promissory register of capitalism. Promises are the first thing to arrive when developers start making plans. These quickly turn at least some villagers into project spokesperson, often prominently featured in public venues, to tout the commoner's apparent desire for modern houses, roads, possibly education, and even jobs. Promises help demonstrate that uncertainty is not another form of expert risk calculation. Rather, promises link together and also blur the experts and vernacular forms of speaking and knowing. But how does one evaluate a promise? In one meeting in Vientiane, project developers were courting MIGA, the political risk insurance arm of the International Monetary Fund. In order to secure political risk insurance from the IMF, it required a project consultation to assure everyone that the project villagers in fact consented to this project. These public consultations are designed to fulfill due diligence for international lenders, and they function strictly as calculated performative rituals of state. A panel of 3 villagers spoke to the attendees in the conference room of a prominent hotel in downtown Vientiane. In the pair of wings, a pair of creepy state security officers made sure that the villagers knew what was expected of them. Yes, of course, we want to support the government's aims in exchange for new houses and education, the villagers told the assembled audience. I wouldn't call into question their sincerity, certainly nobody in the room called into question their sincerity. But one technician from the Department of Agriculture and Forestry asked the only question of note: how are you going to feed yourself if you no longer have any rice fields? The villagers didn't have any answer, suggesting the power of uncertainty to disrupt the performance of state. Now, for me, this question actually resonates in multiple registers. It doesn't settle down. How are you hill rice farmers from an upland valley, how are you going to make it in the lowlands by the road on marginal land? Right? And how are you going to do it? Like, concretely speaking, what are you going to do to survive in these areas? And finally, what are you going to eat? Right? We're talking about food. How are you going to actually provide for yourself in this new living situation that you're contemplating? So do you have any idea what you're actually getting into when you say this thing that you agreed at this project? The issue potentially concerns the demise of their whole livelihood strategy upon which their autonomy and their comprehensive way of life depends. So in this, we can see that uncertainty can actually be a kind of diagnostic mode of experience that can form the basis for learning how to ask better questions and demanding greater responsibility from promoters of things like large dams. If we understand concrete socio-technical objects like dams as transformative and powerful, then uncertainty helps assess how their powers constantly exceed the forms of knowledge available for comprehending them. This brings me to the question of management. Because at the same time, promises also forge a relationship to the possible. Anyone in an executive position knows that promises beget expectations, and expectations need to be managed. So management is my second term of uncertainty. Now, the Thun Hin Bun Dam that I started out with, that's the basis of my book, was interesting to me partly because it was significantly targeted by transnational activists, in particular the International Rivers Network based in Berkeley. And their campaign had actually been pretty successful. They had actually managed to secure some significant concessions from the dam, so the company committed $10 million in budget and made a substantial promise to address the problems that had been raised. Now, I was really interested here in the response of the company after this campaign, right? So this was the basis of my main body of field work. And after that campaign, Thune Hinman Company hired a new manager, well-versed in American risk management techniques for what Stuart Kirsch and Peter Benson call harm industries, thinking about corporate risk management for mining companies, tobacco companies, anything that deals with harm related to reputational risk to the companies. These forms of corporate techniques have massively expanded since the 1980s. Of course, they go back earlier than that, but corporations have gotten very savvy for managing these kinds of reputational risks. In many respects, the original issue is that the activists had managed to be effective because the way the company originally responded was that they acted exactly as you might expect a powerful resource extraction company to respond. They belittled what villagers had to say, they accused activists of lying, they demonstrated that they didn't have any clear understanding of what was going on the rivers, and it also became increasingly clear that the developers had a very tight connection with finance, including sort of a revolving door between people working at the Asian Development Bank and working at the company. So they looked exactly like what a dirty hydropower company should look like, in a sense they played directly into what the activists were saying. So this new manager, whose name is, the pseudonym is Richard in my book, he comes in and he's incredibly charismatic. He's very open and personable. He goes out of his way to meet people and talk to people, shake their hands, listens carefully to people, even solicited feedback from the activist group himself. In my book, I call this performance-based management, partly because it's extremely embodied and performative, right? But partly also because it's very much results-oriented. He is really interested in identifying the real relationships that cause activists to be important and to try and manipulate those or modify those as a way to protect his company better. So he really focused in on a few key terms that I'll just briefly mention. One, he really worked hard to reform the image of the company, right? Through a new narration of the company having been reformed and taking these problems quite seriously. He also worked to really shift the affect of the company. The activist campaign was really ugly. People were quite upset with each other. There was a lot of negative emotion. And he worked really hard to try and get a sense of goodwill so that people weren't angry at the company. They couldn't feel like they could legitimately be angry at the company. The third thing that he really worked on a lot was the network of relations that the activists had been able to exploit. They had really undermined the company's relationship to the Asian Development Bank. And because the manager was working directly with the activists and encouraging them to talk directly with him, he kind of quite explicitly cut the Asian Development Bank out of the picture, so they didn't know what was going on, right? So what's interesting to me about this is that he's really concerned with these real relationships that the company is enmeshed in, right? His approach is not based on some kind of authoritative knowledge claiming to have better facts about what's happening on the ground. It's also not a kind of quantitative risk analysis that might be trying to calculate the monetary value of these risks, in some sort of like a form of statistical knowledge or something like that. Instead, it's intuitive, it's personalistic, it's embodied, it's relational, it's quasi-ethnographic, right? He's really listening to people and trying to sculpt the way that they think about the company. So it's exactly the kind of relational knowledge, that people working in actor network theory might emphasize. Certainly, the kind of things that anthropologists might pay attention to. So if Richard is managing the company's risk exposure to activists, then managing seems like a relationship to uncertainty that's not through authoritative mastery, and it's not through the calculative logics of risk, but rather it's this kind of intuitive and personable knowledge And yet it's always concerned with the question of threat and opportunity to the company itself. Maybe people have heard of something called a SWOT analysis. Anybody ever heard of a SWOT analysis? This is like if you do strategic planning in an organization, you identify the strengths and weaknesses and also the opportunities and threats that you face. Well, opportunities and threats are what define external environment from that corporate perspective. These are terms that are intimately related to uncertainty, right? Like what kind of opportunities can we exploit? What kinds of threats do we need to watch out for? So it's not about authoritative knowledge and rational control. To manage a problem is not to fix it, but to make it go away by other means. So to manage is to handle from the root mass, right? So this brings me to my third term, apprehension. But before I get to that, I just want to mention a couple of cautionary notes, things that I don't mean when I'm talking about uncertainty. Uncertainty is not a gesture of helplessness, as in to say we don't know anything, we don't know, or that we can't do anything. It's also not simply an absence of predictability or a lack of clarity. Right? There's another move that's sometimes made in anthropological narratives when they want to talk about things as being indeterminate, and it's where it's like sort of unpredictable conjunctions sort of mark the limits of the things that we can know. So for me, uncertainty situates my inquiry rather at the breaking points where knowledge falls apart and people have to reconstitute their capacity for existence. So villagers' future dispossession is certainly predictable, but that doesn't really tell us how they recompose their lives after the fact, right? Nor does it inform the calculus they might invoke when they decide whether or not to accept the terms of a compromise and commit to an unknown future that it betokens. And then the most important thing, uncertainty is not an argument against understanding the systemic effects of transformed environments, right? We can certainly understand a lot about the systemic effects of these forms of dispossession and harm. Rather, by holding open diverse ecological futures, staying attentive to their potentiality, uncertainty offers an ethnographic mode for paying attention to the multiplicity of powers swirling around new environmental and material relations. Indeed, uncertainty demands vital attention to the specificity of real relations. For people living along these damaged rivers, these relations matter a lot. The term apprehension evokes an affect, but it also evokes an attempt to grasp the actuality of a dangerous situation. It helps me describe an unstable relation to vital matters of fact that can neither be taken for granted nor interpreted transparently. This is the water coming out of the powerhouse. The powerhouse is off to the left. This is not peak flow by any stretch of the imagination. The dam itself and the reservoir is behind that mountain ridge. And so it's a 5-kilometer tunnel that comes and goes through the mountain ridge before it gets to the powerhouse. And the river, the main river that it goes into, is just sort of like where I'm standing, and it's much smaller and constantly eroding, right? So downstream from the powerhouse of the Toon Hinboon Hydropower project, the Hinboon River has suffered extensive and continuous erosion since the dam was opened in 1998. At peak flow, it puts out about 110 cubic meters per second of water, and that's doubled since my research because they built an expansion project upstream. This is a picture of the erosion. The dam's pulsating effluent cuts against the banks of the rivers, steadily eating away at the land as soil sloughs off the bank, which is now undercut and largely inaccessible. Once gardens were planted here, all along this fertile flood zone. Now the river is progressively wider and much shallower. The turbid waters carry heavy loads of suspended solids, which sharply reduces the photosynthesis that's at the core of the aquatic food web. In addition to the expansion project that I just mentioned, it's quite important that it's a transbasin diversion scheme because that water was never in this river before, right? It's coming from this much larger river upstream. Okay? In addition to the suspended solids, hundreds of tons of sand and gravel are being pushed along the riverbed in different pulses and waves, moving downstream as waves of sediment that smother rapids, which are prime breeding grounds, and fill the deep pools that are important fishing habitat. Since these sandbanks move, the annual flooding of adjacent rice fields now varies dramatically, even while the volume of the monsoon rains is also supplemented by the extra water from the hydropower dam. During the time of my research, floods lasted much longer and were less predictable. Villagers began to describe certain fields as risky paddy, nasian, right? Which I believe is a neologism that really indexed the dilemma about whether you could plant a field in a particular year or not. Nasian might flood for 3 years, or might not flood for 3 years, slowly seducing farmers back into planting in the area, and then they would plant, and then it would flood, and they'd lose their crops, right? So it's this question about whether that land is usable anymore in a case, in an area where farmland is scarce and quite valuable. Moreover, the silt-laden water reduced the number of days that the rice plants could stay submerged. The silt caused bacterial growth on the stalks of the rice, and then the weight of the silt also caused the rice plants to fall matted down and begin rotting instead of recovering after the flood. So you can think about apprehension as indexing a kind of structure of experience that's tightly linked to the articulation of these kinds of material semiotic relation. Siang here, risky, carries much of this connotation since it directly invokes the question of whether we should plant or not, right? Should we plant in this field or not? It doesn't evoke the kinds of statistical reasoning central to expert debates around risk. I like the term apprehension because it invokes knowledge and affect, but it doesn't presume mastery. It lets expertise articulate with vernacular knowledge in unexpected ways. It also includes the root hand, right? It's to grasp, to sort of pre-grasp is sort of the literal meaning of the roots of apprehension. Indeed, apprehension suggests that one knows just enough to understand that looming possibilities may be disastrous and carries the connotation of grasping toward a viable future. Grasping toward a viable future might be figured in terms of commitment. So this brings me to my fourth term. And it allows me to discuss some of the company's environmental management work. How does one live on a river that has been transformed in ways fundamentally difficult to understand and assess? This question concerns the difficulty of knowing in advance shifting in ecological and economic possibilities, but it also concerns what kinds of transformations may be required. Personal and social transformations may be required to conform to powerful new socio-technical dynamics. Who must we become to adapt to a situation that we don't even understand very well? What are we getting into? I use the term commitment to capture the difficulty of knowing in advance who one might become when one is given over to relations that far exceed conditions for knowing them. Commitment thus describes the terms of consent when people affirm power relationships that they can't really assess at the outset. How to live along these rivers was especially germane in the context of the hydropower company's sustainability efforts, which sought to recast village life in opportunistic, aspirational, and motivational terms. They were trying to train villagers to be good market actors. And you'll notice that opportunistic, aspirational, and motivational all imply the sort of dynamic relationship to a risky future. In particular, the ongoing transformation of the river placed tremendous emphasis on experiments with dry season rice. The possibility of benefiting from a second harvest each year during a time in which there was no threat of flooding captured the imagination of farmers and technicians alike. This program involved village credit schemes, provisioning of fertilizer and high yield seed, and especially the promulgation of a new ethos of motivated, market-oriented entrepreneurialism. From the hydropower company's technical standpoint, They couldn't really imagine ongoing village life outside of a market-based future. Yet regardless of that entrepreneurial future, the sustainability efforts required villagers to commit to new power dynamics that were seductive, yet murky and frequently unintelligible. Geo, a young farmer who had already been planting some dry season rice, had been enrolled in the company's pilot program and was involved in the push to expand this core component of their environmental management strategy. At the outset, he was very eager, speculating aloud about being able to buy a hand tractor if the crop was good. Later, when the company technicians made their rounds, they argued the seed they had received had smelled bad out of the bag and it never sprouted. The technician suggested that he had let it soak too long or bruised the seed by treating it too roughly. But Gale and his neighbors rejected that argument and demanded new seed, only some of which germinated. The fertilizer had also been damaged. The 50-kilo bags had turned into hard bricks when it should have been a fine powder. Many farmers readily embraced the possibility of commercial production through enhanced methods. Their mode of affirmation was built upon their commitment to expertise and a new domain of material relations. They had to figure out how to work with these technicians as well as fertilizer and seed and debt. So that in turn required an elaborated relationship with the company and its technicians. Like many farmers, Gale was convinced that the fertilizer was the problem. They had been instructed to put on too much and they were unable to spread it evenly. What had been promised as technical wizardry had suddenly shifted to a different kind of imaginative uncertainty in which they had to finesse a cruddy product. Using a hammer, they smashed the bricks of fertilizer into chunks the best they could, wondering if it would release its magic into the soil or perhaps burn the plants because it was too concentrated. The rice then grew beautifully full and tall, but it never flowered and there was almost no grain. Ultimately, his fields yielded only about 1 ton, a far cry from the grandiose promises of the technicians. Meanwhile, the technician insisted that these problems were caused by a parasite that had affected farmers across the region. Gale laughed heartily, or maybe it was bitterly, when I suggested next time maybe the advice will be better. He won't be back, he said. He said we might get 10 tons. Yet the debate with the company had shifted. Saifong, another field technician, had come by several times, badgering them to repay loans taken out for the failed crops. The villagers mocked her in gendered tones. "She's like a busybody auntie trying to find out what you spent your money on," one said. They simply didn't feel responsible for paying back the loans. But Saifong's argument was different. If they don't make the payments into the fund, where will they borrow money from next season? A former chief who had been involved in setting up the project showed me a list of all the farmers and their debt commitments he had signed when the original disbursement was made. He expressed regret for helping sell the program to his village. We believed the company and followed all the directions. Now there's no trust. Like the eroded boundary between water and soil that refused to settle into a stable relation, villagers' lives were thrust into a new domain of technical and economic expertise. Commitment to the rules of the game meant entering into a pact with far-reaching consequences, especially, one, this requisite entrepreneurial ethos in which they had to figure out how to take responsibility for themselves. Two, the demand for trust and expertise when the experts nonetheless wouldn't take responsibility for their mistakes. And three, this threatening horizon of new marketing declarations. For Gale and his neighbors, commitment implied holding on to the thin possibilities of a personal transformation, even while it produced a chaotic unraveling of its own premises. Commitment is a wager. After all, it is possible that joining the ranks of intensified market production just might work through a big push like this. In that sense, commitment implies imagining a future that might be possible, but only if everything works just right. So I've emphasized these 4 terms: promise, management, apprehension, and commitment. It seems to me they offer a pragmatics of real relations that emphasize the material and the cognitive, but also the affective. They're not symmetrical terms, right? Management in particular describes corporate strategy for disempowering the ability for other people, in this case, to affect them. The other 3 terms relate more directly to the structure of experience for villagers. But what I want to emphasize here is uncertainty as a method for a materialist theory of knowledge and also subject formation, by emphasizing what is not known and how people grapple with the terms of their experience and their predicaments. Uncertainty prioritizes these powerful relationships that constantly jeopardize what were otherwise relatively stable assemblages of life and living. In that sense, people are forced to think. This comes from Isabel Stinger's The Philosophy of Science, who's thinking about how, in particular kinds of experimental conditions, people are forced to think in ways that they're uncomfortable with. And they have to reconstruct their knowledge based on new situations. It's not just their knowledge, of course, it's also their practices. So it's a methodological term that focuses on the limits of knowledge, where material relations exceed rationalities of control. Now, I think this actually has a lot to do with late industrial environments in general, not just around extractive environments. Because we see many different domains in which the production of uncertainty has a systematic effect that comes out of different kinds of capitalist relations of productions. Also colonial relations of productions, right? In which the powerful modes of acting among certain corporate actors systematically disable other forms of life. Since I'm coming at this from science studies, especially sort of feminist science studies, I note that this structure of relationship to knowledge really challenges predominant theories of knowledge, such as those of Foucault and Latour, which these are very much oriented towards established truth effects of regimes of expertise, such as medicine, or the construction of stable facts about the natural world. But here we have a situation in which we don't have an effective regime of expertise, in which it's very hard to determine stable facts about the natural world. The natural world itself is constantly changing, right? In particular, the Toon Hindu Power Company did everything it could to not stabilize facts about its environmental impacts. And if we think more broadly about debates around the Anthropocene, sort of long-term environmental change from around the world, especially in colonial context, in many cases we see very deliberate projects for some actors to produce uncertainty in lived ecologies around the world. So we might consider whether late industrial environments are constituted by uncertainty, and the concluding thought that I would leave you with then is that late industrial environments are not characterized by stabilized forms of power and knowledge, but by the actual production of active, dynamic ecological events, like climate change, for example, that could exceed our capacity of knowledge, and to which we respond with increasingly desperate proposals. So it strikes me that this relationship to uncertainty perhaps has relevance not only for what's happening in Laos, but also for many things that are experienced by other people around the world as well. And I'll leave it with that and happily entertain any questions.